I'd heard about it before I got there. Everyone who grew up in this part of Nebraska has. It's not the kind of thing people say out loud at a bar, but they say it. Low, like they're passing along an inconvenient fact they'd rather weren't true. My Uncle Earl never brought it up directly, but when he called asking me to come look after the farm while he was in the hospital in Kearney, there was a pause before he hung up. Just a pause. I understood what was in it. I got there around 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in September. The sun was still high, but already had that end-of-day color, too orange, the kind that makes everything look drier than it is. The farm sits on a dirt road that branches off of 44 and disappears into the cornfield after about 300 yards. When the corn is that tall, deep into a late harvest, you can't see a thing on either side. Just the packed dirt corridor ahead, and the rows closed in like walls. Earl's corn was dry, the stalks hard, the leaves that old straw color that rustles when the wind hits. There was no wind. The house is simple, wood painted white too many years ago, with a front porch and a red barn about 40 yards back. Between the house and the barn there's a dirt yard where Earl used to keep his equipment. Behind the barn, the corn starts up again and runs as far as you can see, which isn't far. It never is. I went in, opened the windows, put my things in the bedroom facing the porch. The house smelled like old wood and something I couldn't name. Not mold, more like still air. The smell of a place that had been closed up too long. I messed with the thermostat, turned on the kitchen light, put water on to boil. I did what you do when you arrive somewhere that isn't yours and you're trying to turn it into something livable. I went to check on the animals before dark. Earl had 3 working dogs penned up in a fenced area next to the barn, and a few pigs in a sty out back. The dogs greeted me with that animal restlessness of something that recognizes a human presence, but doesn't recognize you specifically. Short bark, a sniff, another bark. I put out food, checked the water, went to see the pigs. Everything normal. It was on my way back across the yard that I saw it. On the left side of the house, where the corn starts about 10 yards from the side fence, there was a section of rows that looked visibly different from the others. The corn there was flattened, leaning at an angle. Some stalks snapped clean at the ground. The strip was maybe 6 feet wide and ran in a straight line into the field, disappearing into the darkness that corn creates even in daylight. I walked up to the fence and stood there looking. The first thing you think is animal. Deer, wild hog, something big that came through fast. But deer don't snap mature corn stalks that way. They bend, they veer, they go around. What was in front of me hadn't gone around anything. It had come through in a straight line like the stalks weren't there, and the stalks were thick enough that this said something about the size and weight of whatever had passed. I stood there longer than I needed to. I know what people say about this area. I know because I grew up hearing it, because my grandmother told it with the seriousness of someone passing along useful information, because there are names of people who disappeared into this kind of cornfield and were never found, and the official explanation never quite added up. I'm not the type to believe just anything, but I'm also not the type to dismiss what serious people have repeated for generations. There's a difference between superstition and collective memory. What I'd been hearing my whole life had the texture of collective memory. So I stood there looking at those flattened rows and didn't pretend to myself that it was a deer. I went back inside when the sun was fully gone, warmed up something I'd brought with me, ate without paying much attention to the taste, washed the dishes. I tried calling the hospital number to talk to Earl, but the signal inside the house was exactly what Earl had warned me it would be. Almost nothing. One bar that came and went without warning. I walked out to the porch and held my phone up in the air like an idiot for a few minutes until I managed to send a short text saying I'd arrived. I don't know if it went through. I sat on the porch for a while after it got dark. The sky was clear and full of stars the way it only gets far from a city, and the corn stood on all sides like a dark, quiet wall. Every now and then the wind moved the dry leaves, and the sound was like crumpled paper, a rough rustling that started somewhere and spread. Nothing moved outside of the wind, no sound that shouldn't have been there. I went in around 11, left the porch light on. It took me a while to fall asleep, which was to be expected. I lay in bed staring at the wood ceiling, thinking about the flattened rows. about the straight line that hadn't gone around anything, about the width of that trail. I tried to calculate. I tried to reason it out. At some point I stopped trying and just lay there in the dark listening to the corn sway outside in the wind. I fell asleep without realizing it. I woke up at 2:18 in the morning to a sound that wasn't the wind. The sound that woke me didn't have an easy name. It wasn't the normal rustling of corn in the wind. It was lower, more regular, and it came from a specific place, not from all sides at once the way wind does. I lay still for a few seconds without moving, with that immediate alertness of someone who hadn't been sleeping deep, just waiting. Then I heard it again. It was breathing. There was no other word for it. A long, heavy sound, with a short interval between the inhale and the exhale, coming from somewhere on the left side of the house, the same side where I'd seen the flattened rows earlier. It wasn't the kind of sound you mix up with something else when you're awake and still and paying attention. It was breathing, from something large. I sat up slowly. The room was dark, just a sliver of light from the porch coming through the gap in the window. I listened. The sound continued for another 30 seconds or so, steady, unhurried, and then it stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound. I got up, moved toward the window without turning on any lights, and looked through the gap. The corn on the left side was moving. It wasn't the wind. There was no wind at that moment. The other rows were still, the dry leaves quiet. Only that specific stretch was moving, and the movement had direction. It was coming from inside the field toward the edge, slowly, as if something heavy was making its way between the stalks without any urgency. The corn bent and came back. Bent and came back. The line of movement was straight. I went to the porch. I know I probably shouldn't have, or maybe I should have. I can't say anymore. In the moment, what I felt wasn't exactly courage. It was more like a need to not stay inside, pretending I could choose not to see. If it was what I thought it was, standing behind a wood wall wasn't going to change anything about what was outside. I opened the door slowly and stood on the porch without turning on anything beyond what was already on. The yard was quiet. The barn in the back, dark. The corn surrounding the property formed a continuous wall, tall, closed, with no visible depth from where I stood. On the left side, the movement had stopped. I stood there listening to nothing for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. Then the corn moved again, but this time closer to the edge. 10 yards from where I was, maybe less. An entire row bent to one side and held there for a second before coming back. Then the row next to it, then the one after that. The displacement moved toward the side fence slowly, with no sound of footsteps, just the dry creak of stalks bending under some weight. I stopped breathing. The movement reached the edge of the field and stopped. Nothing came out. Just the corn in the last row, tilted, held against something I couldn't see from that angle, in that light. I stared at that spot for too long. The corn eased back slowly, as if the weight had pulled away. After that, there was nothing. I stayed on the porch for over an hour. The September cold in Nebraska at that hour of the night is dry and gets into your bones without warning. And I was in a t-shirt, but I didn't go back inside. I watched the perimeter of the field, waiting for the movement to return, waiting for the sound to return. Nothing came back. The corn stayed still. The yard stayed quiet. The barn stayed dark. When I finally went back in, I didn't go back to bed. I sat at the kitchen table with the light on and a glass of water I didn't drink, and I thought. I'd spent my whole life hearing the stories. Most people who tell them reach a point where the account goes vague. The thing was seen from a distance, or it was too dark, or whoever saw it was too scared to lock down the details. I always wondered if that vagueness was fear or distance. Now I was on this side of it, and I understood it was both things together. You're scared, and at the same time you're not close enough, and the combination leaves you with the certainty of the sound and the movement, but with nothing concrete enough to hold up in a conversation. What I had was the breathing. Steady, heavy, close. And the movement with direction, with weight, with the logic of something displacing through space. Not random like wind, not nervous like a small spooked animal. Deliberate. Slow. Like there was no rush. That was what kept circling in my head as I sat in the kitchen with the light on. Not the proximity, not the size implied by the weight that bent those stalks. It was the absence of urgency. Something that moves slowly near you in the middle of the night is either afraid of you or it isn't. And everything I'd heard my whole life about what lives in this kind of cornfield didn't include any fear of people. I got up around 4 and walked to the window that faced the left side. From the kitchen angle, I could see the side fence in the beginning of the field. Nothing looked out of place. Just the dark, quiet corn and the old wood fence that would have no trouble at all containing anything I could imagine, and no trouble at all failing to contain what I was thinking about. I went back to bed when the sky started to lighten. I didn't sleep again. I lay there listening to the field wake up with the sun, the dry leaves catching the morning wind, the normal sounds of an empty farm. At some point I heard the pigs moving around in the sty out back. Everything normal. Everything exactly the way it should be in the daytime. That's what the story said too. During the day, nothing. The thing belonged to the night, to the closed-in corn, to the hours when you couldn't see more than a few yards in front of you. I had slept inside that. I waited until the sun was high before going out. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was my body deciding for me. I had coffee, ate something without paying attention, sat in the kitchen until the light outside turned white and direct, the kind of light that doesn't leave big shadows anywhere. Only then did I pull on my boots, lace them up slowly, and go. I started on the left side of the house where the movement had been clearest during the night. The side fence sat about 10 yards from the house wall, an old wood structure with 3 strands of wire, too low to hold anything that didn't want to be held. On the inside of the fence, before the corn started, there was a narrow strip of bare ground. I walked over and looked down. The marks were there. They weren't footprints in the way you picture when you think of animal tracks. There was no clean shape, no toes or claws pressed into the dirt. The ground in that strip was packed and dry, and what was there were depressions, deep, unevenly spaced, as if something very heavy had moved on 4 points, and the earth had given way under the weight without holding the exact shape. I crouched there staring at them for too long, trying to measure the spacing between one depression and the next. The interval between them was long, longer than I wanted it to be. I stood up and walked to where the corn began. The flattened rows I'd seen the afternoon before were still there. The stalk snapped or bent, the straight-line passage running into the field without a single deviation. I stood at the edge for a moment. Then I went in. The corn closes over you fast. After 3 rows, you can't see the fence behind you, can't see the sky properly, can't see anything but stalks and dry leaves on both sides and ahead. The ground inside the field is different from the ground in the yard, softer, with a layer of fallen leaves and old straw that muffles your footsteps. I walked slowly down the flattened corridor, watching the ground, watching the stalks. The broken stalks had been broken at chest height, not bent by the wind, not curved by weight. Broken, the fibrous tissue split cleanly, as if a horizontal force had passed through without bothering to go around. Some were on the ground. Others were still standing halfway, their tops hanging. I ran my hand over one of the breaks. The surface was clean. I kept going in. After about 20 yards, the flattened corridor closed off. The corn on the sides was less disturbed. The stalks went back to standing straight, and the straw ground didn't hold any clear indication of direction. I stopped there, looked ahead, where the field continued closed and quiet. Looked back, where the corridor I'd followed was visible like a scar through the rows. The silence inside corn is different from the silence outside. Out there you still have reference points, the house, the sky, distance. Inside, the corn cuts all of that off. The sound changes too. The dry stalks absorb and muffle, and what's left is a thick stillness that makes you pay attention to things you'd normally ignore. Your own breathing, the rustle of a leaf you grazed without meaning to, the distance between one stalk and the next. I was paying attention to all of that when I saw the other marks. On the right side of the corridor, about 6 feet from the main passage, there was an area where the straw ground was compressed differently, not flattened like the passage. Compressed, pressed down with the straw fibers pushed uniformly flat, as if a considerable weight had stayed in one place for some time. A large area, too wide to be anything I could name without discomfort. I stood looking at it for a good while. There was something wrong with how I remembered getting to that point. I knew I'd followed the flattened corridor, knew I'd stopped when it closed off, but for a few seconds I couldn't reconstruct the last few yards. It was like trying to remember the end of a sentence someone else finished for you. I chalked it up to fear and the heat trapped between the rows, because any other explanation was too large to hold right then. The legend I grew up hearing never had a scale. People described what they felt, what they heard, sometimes what they glimpsed from a distance. But no description gave real dimensions. You hear large, and you build an image that fits your own experience of large. A bear, a heavy animal, something you've seen before or can imagine from what you've seen. What I was measuring with my eyes there inside the corn didn't fit that scale. The compressed area was maybe 6 feet wide. The length was hard to measure precisely because the straw became less pressed toward the edges, but it was long. It was the space something occupies when it stops, when it waits. And it was 6 feet from the line of passage, off the direct route, at a point that sat exactly parallel to the side wall of the house. Parallel to the window of the bedroom where I had slept. I left the corn without running, but without stopping either. Back down the flattened corridor, past the edge of the field, across the bare strip of ground, through the fence. I only stopped when I was in the yard, with the house in front of me and the sun hitting straight down on my back. I stood there looking at the field for a while. The stories I'd heard were about sightings, about sounds, about dead livestock and unexplainable marks and people who went into the corn and took a long time to come back out. None of them were about what I was thinking now, which was simple and direct and impossible to ignore. It had stopped outside my window and stayed there long enough to press the straw flat under its own weight. It wasn't hunting, it was watching, and I was on the wrong side of the window. I spent the rest of the day inside the house. It wasn't paralyzing fear, it was calculation. There was nothing outside that needed doing that couldn't wait, and walking around the yard with all of that in my head wasn't going to give me any useful information. So I stayed. I ate something late in the afternoon. Tried my phone for about 20 minutes with no luck, sat on the porch while the sun went down and watched the perimeter of the field, with the focus of someone trying to memorize something important before a test. Corn in the daytime is just corn. Tall, closed, no depth. You look at it and you see a wall. There's no way to know what's on the other side of a wall. I went inside when it got dark, left the porch light on, the kitchen light on, and went to sit in the bedroom, but not on the bed. I took the desk chair and positioned it facing the window from the inside with the bedroom light off. I could see the yard through the glass, the side fence, the beginning of the field. I couldn't see the barn from that angle, but I could see enough. I waited. The first hour was quiet. The corn stayed still, the yard stayed empty. The sky darkened until it was black and full of stars. I was awake and I was paying attention, and I wasn't in a hurry. If there was anything the compressed straw marks inside the field had taught me, it was that whatever lived out there wasn't in a hurry either. Past midnight, past 1, past 1:30. A little after 2, I heard the barn. It wasn't a gradual sound. It was a single impact, dry and heavy, like something the size of a wardrobe had slammed against the wooden wall from outside. The old wood of the barn vibrated enough for me to hear the creak from 40 yards away, inside the house, with the windows shut. I was out of the chair before I'd decided to get up. I went to the back kitchen window, which faced the yard and the barn. The porch light didn't reach the barn, but the clear sky threw enough light to make out shapes. I stood in the dark kitchen looking through the glass. The barn was quiet. Then the corn behind the barn opened up. It wasn't the corn on the side, not the left field I already knew. It was the field out back behind the barn, which I'd never seen move. The rows at the edge parted slowly, the stalks bending to each side, and the werewolf came out. I stood there watching, unable to do anything else. It was quadrupedal and low for its size. Not low like a dog, but with that weight distributed on 4 points posture that makes something seem simultaneously close to the ground and enormous. Its back came up to the height of the barn fence, which was about 4 feet. The front limbs were long, longer than proportion called for, and moved with the cadence of something that isn't running but covers ground the same way. The coat was dark, the color of the field at night, lying flat against the body in some places and thicker at the neck and shoulders. The head was what didn't fit any reference I had. Wide, elongated at the muzzle, with ears set high and angled slightly forward, like an animal in a permanent state of attention. It wasn't a wolf's head the way you picture it when someone says wolf. It was bigger, heavier, with the impression that the skull had been built around the jaws and not the other way around. It moved across the yard without hesitating, without nosing at the ground, without the nervous caution of a predator in unfamiliar territory. It moved like something that knew the place. It crossed the yard diagonally and stopped about 15 yards from the barn, turned sideways to me. I stopped breathing. The head turned slowly in the direction of the house. Not with a start. Not like an animal that heard a noise. Slowly, with that deliberateness that is worse than any fast movement because it suggests there's no hurry because there doesn't need to be. It stood there looking at the house long enough for me to start feeling the cold of the glass against my forehead, without remembering having pressed my head against it. Then it moved again. It went toward the side fence, the side I already knew, and entered the corn without slowing down. The stalks opened and closed behind it, as if the field were swallowing it whole. The sound was brief, the dry creak of bending stalks, one or two pops of fiber splitting, and then silence. I stood in the dark kitchen for a stretch of time I can't measure. What the legend never conveyed was the actual size. Not the weight, not the height of the back, not the length of the front limbs. The legend said large, and you heard it and built large inside your own experience of large. And large inside the experience of large for anyone who grew up far from anything truly dangerous is a domestic dimension. Manageable, with edges. What had crossed the yard had no manageable edges. And it moved like it knew where it was and knew I was in here. Not like an animal scenting unfamiliar territory. Like something following a route that had already been established before I arrived. I went back to the bedroom. Didn't sit in the chair again. I stood with my back against the wall beside the window, out of the direct line of sight of anything outside looking in, and I stayed there until the sky began to lighten. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. But the silence gave me no comfort because I'd already understood that silence here didn't mean absence. It meant the thing had gone somewhere else inside the field, and the field was far too large for that to be any kind of relief. Dawn came, and I didn't move for a while. I stood with my back against the bedroom wall listening to the light arrive. The way the silence changes when the dark lifts. The sounds of the field waking up. The faint morning wind hitting the dry leaves. I didn't push off from the wall until the sun was visible through the window. White and direct. No long shadows anywhere. I went to the kitchen, put water on to boil, stood in the middle of the room doing nothing for a few minutes. There was a mental list of things that needed doing on the farm. Earl had left it written on a sheet of paper taped to the refrigerator. Check the animals. Check the equipment stored in the barn. Check the back fence perimeter he said was giving way in 2 spots. I folded the paper without reading it again and put it in my pocket. I went outside when the coffee was ready, cup in hand, and walked into the yard. The packed dirt held the marks of what had passed through during the night. Not clean prints, but the irregular compression I already knew from the marks beside the field, the weight pressed into the dry earth at spaced intervals. The line ran from the back field to the spot in the yard where it had stopped, and from there to the side fence. I stood looking at the sequence of those marks and tried not to think about the interval between them, which was long. Then I looked at the barn. The side wall, the one facing the back field, had a new mark in the wood. A long, deep horizontal dent, about 4 feet off the ground. The old wood had given without splitting. It had bowed inward a few inches and stayed that way, the internal fibers of the board exposed and pale against the dark gray of the old paint. The impact I'd heard from the house. I ran my hand over the mark. The board was cold and solid, the compressed wood hard as stone at the point of contact. I did the math on the height. 4 feet was the height of its back when it was moving on all fours. It had passed by the barn close to the wall, and its shoulder had caught the wood. It hadn't been an attack, hadn't been an attempt to get inside. It had been passage, The barn was in the way, and it went through without going around, and its shoulder against the old wood wall had made the sound I'd heard from the kitchen like a wardrobe slamming. I went into the barn. Earl kept the equipment in the front section. Old grates, tools hanging on the wall, some feed sacks stacked in a corner. In the back there was a space separated by a wood partition where he kept 2 smaller pigs apart from the outside sty. Younger ones he was fattening up. The partition had a sliding door that was normally kept shut with a simple bolt. The door was open, not broken off, not smashed. The bolt was pulled back. I stared at that for a moment and then went into the partition. One of the pigs was dead. It was in the back corner, or what was left of it was in the back corner. It hadn't been eaten. It had been destroyed, which is a different word and the only one that applies. What I was looking at wasn't a predated animal, wasn't the clean carcass of a hungry predator. It was the result of a force that hadn't concerned itself with efficiency. Exposed bone, tissue torn in directions that followed no feeding logic, the wood wall behind the animal marked from the floor to nearly the ceiling of the partition. The other pig wasn't there. I left the partition, left the barn, went to the outside sty out back. The pig was there in a corner, motionless but alive, with that stillness of an animal that had spent the night in intense fear and hadn't come out the other side of it yet. I looked at it for a moment. It didn't move. I went back to the yard and stood in the sun. I tried to think clearly. The partition bolt was simple, a sliding bolt that anyone could open with one motion. The werewolf didn't manipulate objects. I knew that from the stories, and what I'd seen the night before had nothing of intentional manipulation to it. It was an animal. It was weight and size and force. It was something biological and concrete. But the bolt was pulled back. I went back into the barn and looked at the bolt more carefully. The wood of the door around the bolt had marks on it. Not claw marks, not bite marks, pressure marks. As if something had shoved the door with enough force that the vibration had made the bolt give on its own, slide in the track from the repeated impact. The wood was dented at the contact point. It was possible. With enough weight and force, it was entirely possible. I went back out. The sun was high and the yard was quiet, and I was alone on a farm 25 miles from town, with a destroyed pig in the barn, and weight marks in the ground, and a wall of corn on all sides that I couldn't see more than a few yards into. I went to the front porch and tried my phone for 20 minutes. Nothing. One bar that came and went, no calls going through, no messages sending with confirmation. I walked to the edge of the property out front, where the dirt road started before it went into the cornfield, and tried again. One bar, sometimes 2 for a few seconds before dropping. I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table with Earl's sheet of paper open in front of me and stared at the instructions he'd left. The large, slightly shaky letters of a man who was already sick when he wrote them. Check the animals. Check the equipment. Check the back fence. The back fence that separated the yard from the back field. The field the werewolf had come through the night before. I didn't go check the fence. I folded the paper again, put it back in my pocket, and sat in the kitchen listening to the wind and the dry leaves outside, and trying to understand what I was still doing on this farm. The honest answer was that there was nowhere to go that didn't mean going through the corn, or down the road that cut through the corn, and both options were the same option, and the last thing I wanted was to be inside that field after what I'd seen last night. So I stayed. For now, I stayed. But when the sun started going down, I was going to need a better plan than sitting in a chair in the dark and waiting. I spent the morning trying my phone. Not in any organized way, obsessively, the kind of obsession you develop when you have nothing left to do with your hands and your mind won't stop. I walked from room to room holding the thing up in front of my face, watching the signal bar appear and disappear with no visible pattern. I tried every window in the house. I tried the front porch, the back porch that Earl used as storage and was crammed with boxes and old tools. I tried the yard, the left side of the fence, the right side. I walked to the edge of the property out front where the dirt road started and stood there for 10 minutes with my arm raised like an idiot. 1 bar, sometimes 2, never long enough. I went back inside and ate something standing in the kitchen without sitting down, without paying attention to the taste. When I washed the plate, I noticed there were already two others in the sink. One of them had dried food on it that I didn't remember making. I stood there for a few seconds trying to place it somewhere in the day before, and ended up stacking everything together without thinking about it further. I went to the back window and looked at the barn for a moment, then looked away. I didn't need to see again what was inside the partition. Early afternoon, I tried a different approach. Earl had a landline on the kitchen wall, the corded kind, and I'd spent the first days without even trying it, because I'd assumed a landline on a farm like this wouldn't work any better than the cell. I lifted the receiver and listened. Dead line. Not even static. Just silence. I put it back. I went to the bedroom and dug through the bag I'd brought without being sure what I was looking for. At the bottom, I found a portable charger I'd thrown in there weeks ago and forgotten. The phone was at 42%. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the bar that wouldn't hold. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought more carefully about the signal. Outside worked better than inside. The front of the property worked better than the back. The logic suggested that the farther from the house, the farther from the corn, the better the signal. The problem was that farther from the house meant closer to the field in other directions, and the field was the field on every side except the front, where the road went into the cornfield and ran for about 300 yards before hitting 44. I went to the front porch and stood there looking at the road. 300 yards of packed dirt between walls of tall corn on each side. In the daytime, with the sun at that angle, I could see maybe 50 yards before the road curved slightly and disappeared. The corn on each side was tall and closed and quiet. No sound except the faint wind in the dry leaves. I walked into the road about 20 yards. The signal went up to 2 bars and held. I stood still, waiting for it to drop. It held. 3 bars for a few seconds, back to 2, but stable enough. I opened my contacts and called the number for the hospital where Earl was staying. I heard the ringtone once, twice, 3 times. Someone picked up on the 4th. The receptionist's voice was clear, close, absurdly normal. I asked to be connected to Earl Hollis's room. I heard the click of the transfer, then hold silence. Then the phone started ringing again. Once, twice. The corn on the right side of the road moved. It wasn't wind. There was no wind at that moment, the leaves were still. It was an entire row bending toward the road and coming back, slowly. With that weight I already knew. Then the row next to it. Then the one after that. The movement was coming from inside the field toward the edge, slow and direct, exactly like the first night. The line of movement was about 40 yards from where I was standing. The phone rang a 3rd time in Earl's room. I stood there not knowing whether to stay or run, and while I stood there not knowing, the movement in the corn stopped. Everything stopped. The rows went back to their position, the dry leaves went still, and for a few seconds the only sound was the ringtone pressed against my ear. Then the line went dead. It didn't cut out with the crackle of a lost signal. It just went silent. No tone, nothing. I looked at the screen. 0 bars. The signal icon had disappeared entirely, as if the phone had forgotten that networks existed. I stood in the road a moment longer looking at the spot where the corn had moved. 40 yards. In daylight, with the sun out, I could make out individual rows, the stalks, the line where the field began. There was nothing visible beyond the corn. No sound, no movement. I went back to the house. I tried the phone 4 more times during the afternoon, each time for less long, each time with less expectation. On the last try, around 5 o'clock, I managed to send a text to my oldest cousin's number. He was the person most likely to understand what I was trying to say without needing a long explanation. The message was 8 words. There was no way to know if it had gone through. The sun started going down around 6:30. I did what needed doing before dark, fed the pigs, checked the outside sty, didn't go into the barn. The pig that had survived was in the same corner where I'd found it that morning. It ate when I put the feed down but didn't move from the corner. I left it there. I went back inside before it got fully dark. This time I didn't set up the chair in front of the bedroom window. I went to the kitchen. The window facing the back and the barn was the best position to watch the back field, which was where it had come through the night before. I sat in a chair beside the window, out of the direct line of sight of anyone looking in from outside, and turned off the kitchen light. It was almost 8 o'clock. There were still about 6 hours until 2 in the morning, which was when the corn started moving. 6 hours is a long time to sit in the dark with your own thoughts. I thought about the 8 words I'd sent my cousin. I thought about whether the message had gone through and what he'd do with it if it had. I thought about the movement in the corn on the road while the phone was ringing, about the exact timing of it, whether it was coincidence or whether coincidence was still a word that applied to anything on this farm. Outside, the field went dark. Inside the kitchen I kept waiting, looking through the window at the empty yard and the quiet barn and the back corn that was out there, always out there, closed and tall and with no visible depth, keeping what it kept with the indifference of something that doesn't need to try to hide anything. 2 in the morning came and went with nothing. I kept waiting for the corn to move, waiting for the breathing, waiting for the impact against the barn. Nothing. The yard stayed empty. The back field stayed quiet. The silence was the kind of silence that isn't rest. It's accumulation. By 3 in the morning, I was still in the chair beside the kitchen window with my back aching and my eyes dry and the growing certainty that the night was going to pass without anything happening. At 3:42, the werewolf came into the yard from the left side. I didn't hear it arrive. There was no creak of stalks, no breathing announcing it, no impact against anything. One moment it was dark and empty out there, and the next it was in the yard, standing near the side fence, as if it had stepped out of the dark itself without needing to come through anything. I shrank back in the chair instinctively, even being inside, even with the light off and the glass between me and it. It was closer than the night before. The kitchen window was on the side of the house, and the side fence was about 8 yards from that window. It was maybe 3 yards from the fence. 11 yards between me and it, glass and wood wall in between, and still its scale filled my field of vision in a way that made the kitchen feel smaller. It was standing still, head slightly lowered, front limbs forward, its back tall and wide against the dark of the field behind it. It wasn't looking at the house. It was looking at the ground. I sat there watching without understanding what I was seeing. Then I realized it was looking at the ground at the exact spot where the compression marks I'd found that morning were. The depressions in the packed dirt, the trail from the night before. It was looking at its own tracks. I don't know how long I spent processing that. Not long, but long enough for something inside me to pull back in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't the size, it wasn't the proximity. It was that, the head lowered over the tracks, the posture of something that wasn't sniffing, wasn't hunting. It was checking. It was in the same place it had been before, and it was verifying that it had been there. The head lifted slowly, turned toward the window. It wasn't the slow, indifferent movement of the night. It had crossed the yard and looked at the house from a distance. It was direct, like it knew exactly where to look. The eyes didn't shine. There was no supernatural glare. They were dark, deep, the color of something wet in the dark, and they stayed fixed on the kitchen window long enough for me to feel the cold of sweat on the back of my neck without having noticed I'd broken a sweat. I didn't move, didn't breathe deep. I sat absolutely still in the chair and told myself it was dark inside the kitchen, and that from its position, what was there was glass and dark, and there was no reason for it to know where I was sitting. I told myself that several times. It kept looking at the window. Then it did something that wasn't in the repertoire of any story I'd ever heard. It wasn't an attack, wasn't a movement toward the house, wasn't a sound. It was the opposite. It stepped back. Didn't turn, didn't veer. It took a step backward while keeping its head pointed toward the window, then another, slowly, until the side fence was between it and the house. Then it turned and walked along the fence toward the back of the yard, parallel to the side wall of the house. Its head turned slightly toward the wall as it moved. It disappeared around the corner of the yard in the direction of the back field. I sat in the chair without moving for a long time. What I'd just seen didn't have an explanation that left me comfortable. Animals don't retreat that way. An animal retreats because it was startled, because it sensed a threat, because instinct told it to. What I'd seen wasn't the retreat of a threatened animal. It was a calculated withdrawal. It was the difference between fleeing and choosing to leave, and that difference had a weight that stayed in the kitchen after it was gone. I got up when my legs stopped being pinned to the chair and walked to the central hallway of the house. I stopped. On the hallway floor, in front of the door that led to the back porch, the porch cluttered with boxes and tools that I'd barely stepped into. There was a damp mark on the wood floor, not a puddle, not a wide stain. It was a series of elongated, irregular impressions, the width of something that had dripped while moving. The wood was dark where it was wet. The marks went from the door to the middle of the hallway and stopped. The door was closed. The bolt was in place. I walked toward it slowly and held the bolt without opening it. The wood around it was as cold as it should be. There was no sound from the other side. I looked back down at the floor and followed the marks back to the door, looking at the gap between the threshold and the floor. The gap was about an inch. Enough for the moisture of something standing outside long enough to seep underneath. I stood in the dark hallway, looking at that. It had been standing outside that door, not trying to get in, not scratching, not making any sound, just standing there, in the dark of the cluttered back porch while I was sitting in the kitchen watching the back window waiting on the field. The back porch was on the opposite side of the house. It had been on both sides at the same time, or it had been on one side first and I hadn't heard it, or it had been on this side while I was watching the other and had left before I noticed. There was no way to know which of those three was true, and there was no way to know how long it had been standing outside that door before I got up from the chair. I didn't go back to bed. I stayed in the hallway for a while looking at the damp marks on the floor until the wood dried, which took less time than I expected. When there was nothing left visible on the ground, I went to the kitchen, turned on the light, and sat down with a piece of paper and a pen I found in a drawer beside the sink. I needed to think in order. Not because I'm the kind of person who thinks in order naturally. I'm not. But because the alternative was sitting in the dark, letting my head go to places that weren't going to help me at all. I started writing down what I knew. First night. Movement in the corn on the left side after 2 a.m. breathing. It stayed at the edge of the field. Second night. It was inside the field, stopped parallel to my bedroom window. Weight marks in the straw. Third night. Impact on the barn. Came out through the backfield, crossed the yard, looked at the house, left through the side. Tonight. Came in from the side, stood still over its own tracks, looked at the kitchen window, pulled back, went to the back, and was on the back porch at some point I didn't see. I looked at that paper for a while. What was in front of me wasn't hunting behavior. Hunting has a direct logic: approach, test, attack, or retreat. What was on the paper was something else. It was reconnaissance. Each night a different point on the perimeter, each night closer to something I couldn't name yet. The farm wasn't territory, it was invading. It was territory it was mapping calmly, the way something does when it already knows it's going to stay. I put the paper in my pocket alongside Earl's instruction sheet. The instruction sheet was more worn than I remembered. The folds had gone soft, nearly torn at the edges, as if I'd opened and closed that paper dozens of times. But I only remembered doing it a few times. When the sun came up, I did what I hadn't done the day before. I walked the entire perimeter of the property slowly, starting from the front and going along the left side, across the back, along the right side, back to the front. I took my time. I stopped at every point where the fence came close to the corn, crouched down, looked at the ground, looked at the edge stalks. The marks were all the way around, not with the same intensity everywhere. Some spots had deep, clear depressions. Others had only a slight compression in the dirt that you could ignore if you didn't know what you were looking for. But they were there, distributed, marking stopping points all along the edge of the property. I noted them on the paper as I walked. When I came full circle back to the front, I had 13 points marked. 13 stops along the perimeter. Some on the sides, some in the back, 2 in the front. One near the entry fence, one closer to the house than I wanted it to be. I went into the barn and grabbed a tape measure Earl kept hanging on the wall next to the tools. I went back to the points and measured the intervals between them. Not with any engineering precision, just an estimate. The tape stretched along the fence from one point to the next. The intervals were regular. Not perfectly regular, not machine regular, but with the consistency of a pattern that repeated without needing to be conscious of itself. Like a stride, like a patrol. The difference between the shortest interval and the longest was less than 12 feet. I stood in the yard with the tape measure in my hand and the paper in my pocket, and let that settle. It followed the same route. Every night, the same perimeter, the same stopping points, the same intervals. It wasn't the behavior of an animal testing a fence for a weak spot. It was the behavior of an animal that already knew every point of that fence and was verifying they were still the same. It was guarding the place. Guarding it for what was a question I didn't want to answer. So I didn't. Instead, I thought about the road. 300 yards of packed dirt between walls of tall corn before hitting 44. I'd gone about 20 yards into it the afternoon before the corn moved. Daytime, sun out, and I'd come back. But the alternative to crossing that road was staying inside the farm, waiting for something to change. And nothing was going to change because the cell phone didn't work, and the landline was dead, and there was no other way out except through the corn. But if I went through the corn at night, I was going with it. And if I went during the day, I was going when it was somewhere in the field I couldn't see or predict. I went to the front of the property and stood at the entrance to the road, looking at the 300 yards separating the farm from the highway. The corn on each side was quiet and tall and completely closed off. The sun was almost directly overhead, the most direct light possible, minimal shadow. If there was a moment to go, it was this one. But there were the marked points on the paper, the 2 points on the front perimeter. One of them was right at the edge of the road entrance. I crouched down and looked at the ground at that spot. The marks were there, deeper than most of the other points. It wasn't a passing stop. It was a long stop. The dirt was compressed over a wider area, like at the points I knew from when it had stood still long enough to press its real weight into the ground. It stopped here, at the entrance to the road, at the only way out of the property. I stood up and walked slowly to the edge of the corn on the right side of the entrance. I crouched again and looked at the ground inside the field, in the first few rows. The marks went into the corn toward the interior of the field and disappeared in the darkness between the stalks. I went to the left side and did the same. Identical marks, same depth, same pattern. It entered the field from both sides of the road entrance. I stood looking at the road for a long time, the sun warm on my back, the corn quiet on each side. The 300 yards of packed dirt stretched out in front of me. The distance was short. Under any other circumstances, it was a 3-minute walk. 5, if you took it slow. But 5 minutes inside a corridor with 2 walls of closed corn on each side, no lateral visibility at all, with an animal that covered ground without making noise and knew that field better than I ever would. I went back to the house. I was going to need a night without it on the perimeter, or a window of time within the pattern I'd mapped, or something I hadn't thought of yet. I sat in the kitchen and unfolded the paper again. I stared at the 13 points and thought about which one of them would be farthest from the road at the moment I needed it to be far. I spent the rest of the day waiting. There was nothing left to map, nothing left to measure. I had the paper with the 13 points. I had the interval pattern. I had the logic of the perimeter it walked every night. What I didn't have was certainty that the pattern would repeat exactly the same way, and a decision based on a pattern that could vary was a bad decision. But staying was equally bad, and spending another night inside the farm while it circled out there was becoming an option my body was starting to refuse in ways I couldn't ignore. If I waited another day, I wasn't sure I'd still be able to decide to leave. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating right. I spent the nights in a chair and the days walking the perimeter as if movement could substitute for sleep. There were gaps in the day I couldn't account for properly. Small ones at first. An hour that vanished between the kitchen and the porch, the mug turning up cold somewhere I didn't remember leaving it. I chalked it all up to exhaustion, because I needed it to be exhaustion. I decided to go before 2. The reasoning was simple. The deepest marks at the road entrance were long stop marks, and a long stop suggested it stayed there for a stretch of time, but not the whole night. The pattern I'd observed showed it moving, going into the field, coming out through the yard, coming back around the other side. If there was a moment when the road entrance was clear, it was when it was on the opposite side of the perimeter completing the circuit, about 200 yards of perimeter between the road entrance and the back of the property, walking slowly, with the weight it carried, maybe a few minutes between one point and the other. I needed 5 minutes on the road. The math seemed reasonable while I was sitting in the kitchen with the paper in my hand. Stopped seeming reasonable at 11 at night when I got up from the chair and walked to the front door. I stood there with my hand on the knob for a while. I opened it. The front yard was quiet, the dirt road starting about 10 yards from the porch. The corn on each side of the entrance dark and closed. The sky was as clear as it had been every night, all the stars there. They're light enough to make out the pale ground of the road against the dark of the corn walls on each side. No sound except the faint wind in the dry leaves. I came down the porch steps slowly and crossed the yard. I stopped at the road entrance and crouched. I looked at the ground at the marks I knew. The dirt was the same as that morning. The deep depressions, the compressed area, nothing new. I went to the corn on the right side and looked into the first rows. Dark, quiet, no visible movement. I went into the road. The first few yards were the worst because I could still see the house behind me and knew I was choosing to move away from it. After about 20 yards, I stopped looking back. I looked ahead, at the 300 yards I had to cover, and started walking at a steady pace that wasn't a run but was faster than a stroll. The corn on each side was about 6 feet from the center line of the road. Close enough that lateral vision was useless. You could see the edge of the rows and then immediate darkness between the stalks. Anything 10 feet off the path was invisible. I was about 50 yards into the road when the corn on the left side moved. I stopped. It wasn't the wind, it was the same movement I knew. One row, then the one next to it, weight with direction, displacement in a straight line coming from inside the field toward the edge of the road. But it stopped before reaching the edge. The last rows before the path stayed still. The movement disappeared back in there, about 15 feet from the road, and didn't reach me. I stood still for a moment that lasted too long. I kept walking. About 30 yards further, the corn on the right side moved. Same pattern, coming from inside in a straight line, stopping before the edge. Closer this time, the outer rows swaying slightly before going still. I stopped again. I tried to calculate. Tried to apply the perimeter reasoning, the interval pattern, the math that had seemed reasonable in the kitchen. But inside the road with the corn closed on both sides and the dark ahead and behind, the numbers wouldn't stay still in my head. I kept walking, faster now, 20 yards, 30. The corn on the left moved again, and this time the movement didn't come from inside outward. It came parallel to the road, keeping pace, the rows bending in a sequence that matched my stride. I stopped. The movement stopped. I walked. The movement walked. I stood in the middle of the road with my heart beating in my throat and tried to think. It wasn't coming out of the corn. It wasn't blocking the road, wasn't in front of me, wasn't behind me. It was inside the field walking parallel to me, on the left side keeping its distance matching the rhythm, as if it were guiding me, as if it knew where the road led and knew I was trying to get there. I looked ahead. The highway had to be about 150 yards out, halfway. I looked at the corn on the left side. Quiet now, the rows still, no visible movement. But I knew that quiet wasn't absence. I started walking again, faster, almost running, eyes straight ahead, feet on the packed dirt. My breathing coming out quicker than I wanted. The corn on the left started up again, parallel, steady, closer to the edge now than before. Then the right side too. Both sides together, the movement coming toward the road from both sides simultaneously, the outer rows curving slightly inward as if the corridor were getting narrower. I ran. I didn't decide to run. My feet decided. I covered the last stretch without looking at the corn, without looking sideways, with the sound of my footsteps on the packed dirt and the rustling from both sides growing louder, and the asphalt line of the highway appearing ahead like something I wasn't allowed to believe in until I was standing on it. I came out of the corn and stopped on the shoulder of 44 with my knees wanting to give out. I stood there catching my breath for a moment. Then I turned and looked back at the entrance to the dirt road. The corn was still. The rows at the edges, the last ones before the asphalt, were motionless, the dry leaves not stirring. No movement, no sound beyond my own breathing, and the wind on the open highway. But I knew it was in there. A few yards from the asphalt, stopped where the field ended, on the inside of a line it hadn't crossed for some reason. I stood looking at that edge for too long, the highway empty in both directions. The corn closed in front of me, trying to understand whether I had escaped or whether I had arrived exactly where it wanted me to arrive. There was no way to know, and that uncertainty was by far the most disturbing thing about the entire night. I stayed on the shoulder of 44 until the sky started to change. There wasn't much else to do. The highway was empty in both directions. No headlights, no sound of an engine. The wind on the open road was different from the wind inside the farm. Broader, without the corn walls funneling everything into a single direction. But I was still facing the entrance to the dirt road, and the corn was still there, closed and dark, with 30 or 40 yards of corridor visible before the curve that disappeared toward the farm. No movement, no sound coming from in there. I sat down on the asphalt with my back to the corn, because staring at it any longer wasn't going to give me anything, and it was costing me something I had no surplus left to spend. The asphalt was cold through my jeans. I hugged my knees and looked at the empty highway, and focused on breathing at a pace that wasn't the pace of someone who had just run out of fear. It took a while. The sky lightened slowly. First dark gray, then lighter gray. Then that faint orange strip on the horizon that announces the sun without being the sun yet. As the light grew, the corn behind me went from dark to yellow, the dry leaves taking on color, the stalks becoming visible one by one. The world started having dimension again. I got up when there was enough light to see the ground. I didn't go into the dirt road. Didn't go back to the farm, didn't go get my bag, didn't go check on anything. Everything I'd brought was still in there and would stay in there. I turned south and started walking down the highway shoulder in the direction of Kearney. I walked for maybe 40 minutes before checking my phone. 3 bars. The signal of the open highway, away from the corn, away from the farm. The screen lit up and showed what I expected. No critical battery, the portable charger had held up. But before calling any number, I went to the calendar because there was a count I needed to settle. I had arrived at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon. The phone said it was Monday. I stood on the shoulder looking at the date for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. I counted again. Tuesday arrival, plus the days I could reconstruct. The first night, the morning of the marks, the second night, the barn, the signal attempt on the dirt road, the back porch night, the perimeter mapping day, the night of the escape. 8 days. The phone said 8 days. What I could reconstruct clearly was 4 nights. Maybe 5 if I counted the blurry pieces. The other 2 sat in a space I tried to reach for a moment and found nothing. Not sleep, not waking, not a fragment of memory or sensation. 2 days that weren't anywhere inside me. I lowered the phone and looked at the highway ahead of me. The sun was rising on the horizon, the light hitting the asphalt, the cornfields on both sides of the highway quiet and yellow. Corn everywhere, the Nebraska plains stretching in every direction with those tall, closed walls that you learn not to look at, because looking doesn't get you anywhere. I tried to think clearly. 2 possibilities. Either I had slept for long stretches without registering it, the kind of heavy sleep the body forces when you haven't slept right for days, a blackout of exhaustion that consumes time without leaving a mark, or there was something in those 2 days that I wasn't managing to reach because I wasn't letting myself reach it. I went with the first possibility because the second one had no visible edge, and I needed a visible edge right now. I kept walking. The phone had 12 messages from my cousin, accumulated over the days. I read them in order while I walked. The first ones were replies to the 8-word message I'd sent from the dirt road, short, asking if I was okay, saying he'd try to call. The ones in the middle were longer, the tone shifting from questions to real concern. The last one, sent in the early hours of the night before, was a single line. I went to the farm yesterday. The house was open. I called your name. I stopped walking. I read it again. Then I looked at the date and time of the message and confirmed it was from 11 hours ago, which meant my cousin had been at the farm while I was on the dirt road trying to get out. He had come in through the dirt road, had reached the property, had called my name in an open, empty house. Alone. At night. On that farm. I called him immediately. It rang once. Twice. He picked up on the third, his voice groggy with sleep, and I didn't know for a moment what to say because the first thing I needed to know was whether he was okay, and the second thing was what he had seen, and both questions wouldn't fit in my mouth at the same time. I asked if he was okay. He said he was, that the farm felt strange, that there was a smell in the barn he hadn't wanted to investigate, that he'd called my name around the yard and inside the house and there was no one there. He said the cornfield around the property kept moving while he was there, but there was wind, so he said there was wind. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at the corn on both sides of the highway, the tall yellow walls in the morning sun, the closed rows that wouldn't let you see more than a few yards in. I asked how long he'd stayed at the farm. He said about 15 minutes, that he got uncomfortable and left. 15 minutes inside that property, with the corn moving around him. Maybe he'd managed to leave because he wasn't the one being kept there. Maybe the thing wasn't trying to stop just anyone from coming in or going out. Maybe it was keeping me there. I didn't say what I knew about what that movement meant. I said I was okay, that I was on the highway, that I'd explain everything later. I hung up. I kept walking with the sun on my back and the corn on both sides quiet, and the phone in my hand, and the count I had tried to settle still open, still missing the 2 days, still without an answer to the question I wasn't asking out loud, but that had been there since the moment I'd looked at the date on the screen. What happened during those 2 days was nowhere I could reach, and there was a part of me, small but persistent, that still didn't want to.